A 55-year-old billionaire dropped his wallet at a gas station located beside Interstate 55. Inside was $4,100 in cash, a driver's license, 2 bank cards, and a photo he had carried for 8 years but had never shown to anyone else. He did not go back, did not call, did not lock the cards. He did not even know yet that the wallet had disappeared from his shirt pocket. The person who found it was a 32-year-old woman working the night shift with a salary, just barely enough to keep the most important bills from being overdue all at once. She owed money for car repairs, owed tuition, and had to take her father for dialysis 3 times a week. She could have kept the money. The camera could not clearly see the corner behind the snack counter. No one stood beside her when the wallet was opened at nearly 11 o'clock at night, but she did not take a single bill. What she did afterward would make a man who had spent more than 30 years proving that loyalty does not exist look back at his entire life. It would bring a son back to the house he had left, reopen a career door that had once been closed in front of a woman, and cause the 12-seat dining table in the penthouse by Lake Michigan to hold more than one set of dishes for the first time. And if you think this is just a story about a returned wallet, stay until the end. Because what Marcus received back after that night was not in the $4,100, but in something he had lost long before the wallet fell to the gas station floor. While you listen, let us know which city or country you are watching this story from. Those comments help strangers realize that they are sharing the same story together, even though they are thousands of miles apart. If this story makes you believe that one kind choice can still change an entire life, please give the video a like so more people have the chance to hear it. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to join us for new stories about people, family, and compassion every evening. The man's name was Marcus Elijah Holloway. At 55 years old, Marcus owned Holloway Continental, a construction and infrastructure development conglomerate present in 11 states. The press often mentioned his fortune, the bridges his company built, the commercial districts bearing his name, and the fundraisers where a single signature from Marcus could change the budget of an entire organization. They rarely mentioned the childhood apartment with heating pipes that rattled all winter in Southside, Chicago. Marcus's father used to drive a city bus. His mother worked in the kitchen of an elementary school, returning home every afternoon with the smell of onions, dish, soap, and heat clinging to her hair. There was always too little money in the house, but food was shared equally. When Marcus was young, his mother would often put the last piece of meat into his bowl and say she had already eaten at school. Many years later, he came to understand that some lies are not created to deceive, but to shield a child from feeling that he was taking his mother's share. Marcus learned to work before he learned to rest. At 16, he unloaded goods at a grocery store after school. In the summers that followed, he mixed concrete, painted fences, and mopped office floors at night. By the time he was 24, Marcus had saved his first capital to open a small repair company together with Kevin Price, the cousin who grew up 3 blocks from him. Kevin knew Marcus liked black coffee, knew he was afraid of hospitals, and knew his father had once had to hide his worn-out work shoes with pieces of cardboard. The two of them were not merely partners. They had slept on the office floor together in the early months, taken turns using one old truck, and promised that if one of them managed to step out of the poor neighborhood, the other would not be left behind. 11 months later, Kevin forged Marcus's signature, emptied the company account, and disappeared. What Marcus was left with was equipment lease debt, the wages of 6 workers and contracts he no longer had the means to complete. He sold his car, sold the watch his father had left him, then slept in the office because his apartment had been repossessed. What hurt him most was not the money. It was the fact that Kevin had sat and eaten with his family 3 days before he left, still called Marcus's mother Auntie, and still hugged him at the door just like every other Sunday evening. Marcus never told that story in interviews. He only said that failure taught him caution. But caution was not what was truly born in him that year. What was born was a colder belief. People do not betray because they are bad. They betray when the reward is greater than the price to be paid. He built Holloway Continental on that belief. Every contract had a contingency clause. Every senior employee was vetted through multiple layers. Every relationship had a limit that Marcus set for himself before the other person could get too close. He called it discipline. Diane, his wife, once called it by its true name. Fear doesn't become wisdom just because you dress it in a nice suit. Marcus had remembered that line for the 8 years since Diane passed away, but had never admitted she was right. His company had a scholarship fund for workers who wanted to return to school. Marcus approved the fund's budget every year, but had never once read a recipient's file in full. To him, it was simply a line item required in the Community Responsibility Report, a number to be signed and passed on to another department to handle. His penthouse was nearly 10 times larger than the house where Marcus grew up. It had glass windows looking straight out onto Lake Michigan, a kitchen used more by his private chef than by its owner, and the long wooden table with 12 chairs that Diane had chosen when Julian was still small. She had once said that someday the house would be full of their son's friends, late dinners, and the sound of people competing to tell stories. Now there is only one plate on the table. Julian was 21 now. He had inherited his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, but the two of them had not spoken in nearly 5 months. Their last call ended after Julian discovered that Marcus had asked his assistant to run a background check on his new roommate. Marcus called it protection. Julian called it proof that his father had never trusted anyone. "I don't want to spend my whole life proving that I won't betray you." After Julian hung up, Marcus sat motionless at his desk for 13 minutes. Then he opened his computer, answered emails, and continued a life in which every minute had value, except for the minutes he did not know what to do with his loneliness. That evening at the end of February was the anniversary of Diane's death. Marcus took the keys to the Mercedes, put his phone in his shirt pocket, and left the penthouse as, beyond the glass windows, the surface of the lake had darkened like a road with no end in sight. Marcus drove south, leaving Chicago's lit-up buildings behind him. Interstate 55 stretched out ahead, flanked on both sides by fields sunk in the gray of late winter. He did not turn on the radio. Diane used to say that music makes people fill silences that should instead be listened to, but Marcus had spent most of his life filling them with calls, reports, and numbers that never asked whether he was doing all right. Diane loved long drives. She always brought pre-cut apples in a plastic container, tissues, 2 bottles of water, and more food than 3 people could ever finish. When Julian was small, he would often fall asleep in the back seat with his shoes still on, his head tilted to one side, while Diane tucked a jacket under his cheek so the seatbelt wouldn't hurt him. Marcus, back then, always wanted to get there fast. Diane, on the other hand, would often point out houses with lit porch lights, old diners, and fields changing color under the sun. She told him there are things that only reveal themselves to those who are not in too much of a hurry. 8 years after her death, Marcus was still driving the same route they used to take to St. Louis, but the seat beside him now held only a folder his assistant had placed in the car that afternoon. He did not open it. Those pages belonged to a life he knew how to handle. The empty seat did not. Marcus always carried a few $1,000s in cash when driving long distances alone. He did not like placing his entire ability to move around in the hands of a bank card, a phone, or any system someone else could lock. His assistant had booked the hotel and completed online check-in that afternoon. The room key was in an app on his phone, so Marcus knew that once he arrived, he could walk straight from the parking lot up to his room without needing to take out his wallet again. By 10:18, the fuel warning light came on. Marcus had passed 2 large gas stations without stopping, then chose a small one near Bloomington because the turnoff was right in front of him. The sign overhead was only half lit. The parking lot had cracks that had been patched over many times, and a trash bin leaned toward the fence as if it had stood there too long for anyone to bother setting it upright again. He filled the tank, zipped up his jacket, and walked inside. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with floor cleaner and cold air slipping in through the automatic door. Under the fluorescent lights, everything wore a pale color. The snack bags on the shelves, the lottery ticket machine, a box of donuts with 3 left, and the woman standing behind the counter. Camille Denise Brooks wore a dark blue uniform shirt slightly too big for her shoulders. Her hair was tied back neatly at the nape of her neck, but a few strands had come loose after a long shift. On the counter, next to the register, was a nursing textbook with a worn spine, a highlighter pen, and a lunchbox with a clear lid, still untouched. A small slip of paper was clipped to the cover, with 3 lines written in blue ink. Monday, 6:10. Wednesday, 6:10. Friday, 6:10. That was the time Camille had to take her father to the dialysis center. She looked up as Marcus set his coffee cup on the counter. "Good evening, sir." Marcus gave a slight nod but did not look directly at her. He tapped his card on the machine, waited for the confirmation beep, then picked up the cup. Camille pulled a paper lid from the stack beside her and placed it near his hand, noticing he hadn't taken one. It was a small gesture, natural enough that Marcus didn't even notice. "There's fog heading south," she said. "Drive a little slower." Marcus had heard hundreds of polite well wishes in his life, most from people who knew his name or knew the value of what he owned. Camille's remark didn't ask for a reply. She simply went back to marking her place in the book, as if a stranger's safety was worth mentioning but not worth being acknowledged for. He took his coffee, pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket to check the time, then walked toward the door. The edge of the phone caught on the leather wallet sharing the same pocket. The wallet slipped out, fell near the base of the snack shelf, and landed hidden behind a box of crackers that hadn't yet been stocked. Marcus didn't hear the small sound. The door opened. A cold draft swept across the tile floor, then closed behind him. The Mercedes pulled out of the lot, merging into the thin stream of traffic drifting south. Camille kept reading for almost 10 more minutes. She underlined a passage about signs of low blood pressure after dialysis, then paused to text her father that she'd pick up more bread on the way home. Isaiah replied with a thumbs-up emoji. He often used it in place of longer sentences because he didn't want his daughter to notice how much more his hands shook after each treatment. Close to 11, Camille closed her book and started tidying the counter. She dumped the old coffee, wiped down the payment machine, checked the fridge door, then walked along the aisles to pick up items customers had left in the wrong spots. Behind the box of crackers, a corner of black leather caught the light. She bent down and picked up the wallet. It was heavier than an ordinary wallet. The leather was soft, the stitching even, almost without a scratch. Camille glanced toward the door, though by then the parking lot held only her Buick and a truck parked near pump number 6. She went back to the counter and opened the wallet to look for identification. The name on the driver's license was Marcus Elijah Holloway, Chicago address. The face in the photo looked more stern than the man who had stood in front of her minutes earlier, but there was no mistaking him. Behind the license were 2 bank cards and a neatly folded stack of cash. Camille counted it once, thinking she'd miscounted. She counted a second time, more slowly. $4,100. Her hand stayed resting on the crisp $100 bills, while her mind had already begun dividing that money into transmission repairs. The medical bills still sitting in the kitchen drawer, the 2 semesters she'd been putting off, and the trips to the dialysis center that the old Buick might not survive another winter. Then she saw the photo tucked behind the stack of bills. A black woman standing in a classroom, wearing a pale yellow dress. Beside her was a boy about 10 years old, his head leaning against his mother's shoulder, his hand still gripping a pencil. The woman was smiling not toward the camera but down at the child, as if in that moment nothing in the world mattered more than having him beside her. Camille turned the photo over. Just 3 words written in blue ink, now faded: Diane and Julian. Camille looked at those 2 names a little longer, then set the photo down on the counter, carefully, as if the old paper might still hold the warmth of the 2 people in it. The woman named Diane was not looking at the camera. Neither was the boy named Julian. They were looking at each other, and that alone made the photo more intimate than any letter. Camille didn't know whether Diane was still alive or had passed away. She only knew that a man had carried this moment in his wallet long enough for the corners to wear thin in the shape of fingers. To understand why $4,100 kept Camille's hand resting on the counter for so long, one needs to understand how her life had been divided up. Not by birthdays, holidays, or summer breaks. Camille's life was divided by her father's dialysis sessions, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, at 6:10 in the morning. Every shift, every class, and every expense had to find a way to fit into the gaps between those 3 fixed points. Camille lived with Isaiah Brooks in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Bloomington. The building was old but not run down. They had a heater that worked, a sofa sunken in the middle, a fridge that hummed constantly, and 2 beds with clean sheets every week. The lack in that home didn't show itself in empty rooms. It lived in the fact that an item had to be used well past its lifespan, a bill had to wait for the next paycheck, and any strange noise from the car could make both of them go quiet. Isaiah had once worked as a maintenance electrician at an auto parts factory. He knew which sounds meant an engine was about to fail, knew how to change a switch in the dark, and used to fix his neighbor's old fans for free. But illness had taken from his hands the work those hands once did with ease. After every dialysis session, Isaiah's fingers would turn cold, strength draining out of him like water running through a pipe left open too long. Camille worked the night shift so she could take her father to treatment during the day. She usually picked Isaiah up at 5:25, bringing a thin blanket and a plastic bag of unsalted crackers. While he was called inside, she would sleep tilted sideways in the driver's seat of the old Buick, a jacket rolled up under her neck. By the time the phone alarm woke her, morning light had already spread across the windshield, and the zipper's imprint would show as a red line on her cheek. She had studied nursing at a community college. Camille didn't choose that path because of posters preaching about nobility. She chose it after sitting beside her father in the clinic time and again, watching elderly patients nod along to instructions they didn't understand. Some didn't know which pill to take before a meal. Some didn't dare ask what time the last bus of the day ran. Some would smile at the nurse, then go out to the parking lot and call their children, admitting they hadn't understood half of what had just been said. Camille wanted to become someone who could tell which nod meant real understanding, and which nod simply meant a patient was too embarrassed to ask. She had completed nearly 2 years of school before Isaiah had to start regular dialysis. At first, Camille took a semester off, then a second semester. Then tuition went up, the car's radiator broke down, and her father's treatments turned going back to school into a door she could still see but no longer had a free hand to open. Isaiah's situation was not some small exception confined to the two of them inside their apartment. According to a CDC report updated in March 2026, an estimated 37 million American adults aged 18 and older, about 14%, are estimated to have chronic kidney disease. Among those aged 20 and older who have the disease, about 87% are unaware they have it. Those numbers are large enough to appear in a national report, but inside Camille's apartment, kidney disease was measured in pills lined up in a plastic box, in cups of water that had to be monitored, and in the number of times Isaiah said he wasn't hungry, so his daughter wouldn't buy more food. 3 years ago, Camille had once thought she would start a family. The man she loved got a good job offer in Dallas and wanted her to come with him. He didn't ask Camille to abandon her father. He simply believed that a long-term care facility could do what she was doing, and that they had the right to start a life of their own. Camille understood the reasoning. She had even packed her clothes into 2 cardboard boxes before realizing that Isaiah was hiding his dialysis shoes under the bed because he didn't want her to see the soles had come loose. She unpacked her clothes, folded them back up, and stayed. The relationship ended with a long hug in a parking lot. No betrayal, no third person, and no one entirely at fault. Precisely because of that, Camille couldn't use anger to forget. She only learned to stop imagining kitchens with 2 people standing side by side in the morning. Now, on the gas station counter was enough money to fix the Buick's transmission, pay off the bills sitting in the kitchen drawer, and buy textbooks for the day she went back to class. The camera above the door faced the register. The corner behind the snack shelf was just a blind spot in the old surveillance system. Marcus was long gone. No one had seen her pick up the wallet. The phone buzzed beside the book. Isaiah was calling to ask if his daughter had eaten dinner yet. "I already ate, Dad." The answer came too fast. The lunchbox still sat untouched to Camille's left. On the other end of the line, Isaiah went quiet for a beat, perhaps because he knew his daughter was lying, or perhaps because he himself had told the same lie too many times. "Don't let one hard day decide who you're going to become." The call ended. Camille set the phone down, her right palm still resting on top of the black leather wallet. That palm did not tremble, but Camille could feel every pulse gathering in her wrist, as if her body were trying to answer in her place. She pulled out the plastic chair behind the counter, sat down and placed the wallet just far enough away that she would not touch it without meaning to. $4,100 sat inside it, making no sound, offering no proposal, yet everything she was lacking suddenly rose to the surface, clearer under the fluorescent light. The Buick had slipped gears twice the week before. The mechanic said the transmission wasn't fully gone yet, but the difference between not gone yet and gone on the road could sometimes come down to one cold morning. Camille had asked for a repair, quote, folded the paper into quarters and tucked it into the drawer with the other bills. She hadn't told Isaiah. If he knew, he would suggest taking the bus to the dialysis center, even though it was more than half a mile from the nearest stop to the clinic door. Part of the money could fix the car. The rest was enough to buy new textbooks, pay the first installment of tuition, and settle the medical bills that were racking up late fees. Camille didn't think about clothes, a trip, or a nicer apartment. Real temptation rarely takes a lavish shape. It usually looks like a car that starts on the first try, a fridge with enough food in it, and a father who doesn't have to check the price of medicine before reading the instructions. She opened the wallet again, looked at the address on the driver's license, then took out her phone to search the name Marcus Holloway. It took only seconds for the screen to fill with buildings bearing his name, ribbon cuttings, articles with photos of Marcus standing among politicians and investors. His net worth was cited in the billions. $4,100 to him was probably smaller than a rounding error in a spreadsheet some employee had to fix before lunch. That thought made it a little easier for Camille to breathe, for a few seconds. Then she looked at the photo again. Diane leaning her head toward Julian, a smile not meant for the camera. Camille thought that Marcus might not remember the exact amount of cash in his wallet, but he would know instantly if the photo went missing. There are things even wealthy people cannot replace, no matter how much they could buy back the house where the photo was taken. She picked up the phone and called the office number she found online. A recorded voice announced that business hours had ended and instructed her to leave a message. Camille gave her name, the gas station's name, and said she had found something belonging to Marcus. When it came to the part about asking him to call back, she paused for a moment and left out the amount of money. She also didn't mention that she would keep the wallet at the counter. Not because she'd changed her mind, but because she suddenly realized it was nearly midnight, and a wallet full of cash shouldn't be left somewhere dozens of people passed through. Marcus had driven south. From the gas station to the cluster of hotels near the next exit was about 39 miles. Camille opened a map, looked at the 3 names lined up along Interstate 55, then checked the clock. She still had more than 4 hours left on her shift. Isaiah needed to be picked up at 5:25 in the morning. If she left right away, she could make it back before he woke up, as long as the car held up and she found the right place. She called Renee, who covered the morning shift. Renee had 2 young children and usually didn't answer calls after 10, but this time she picked up on the 4th ring. Camille only said it was an emergency and asked if Renee could come in early. She didn't mention the wallet. Some decisions become harder to hold on to once you have to explain them before you've even finished making them. 25 minutes later, Renee walked in with a towel, still wrapped around her hair, and a coat thrown over her pajamas. Camille handed over the cash in the register, noted down the stock that hadn't been checked yet, and tucked the wallet into the inside pocket of her jacket. Before leaving the counter, she opened her lunchbox, ate 2 pieces of cold chicken, and finished half a bottle of water. She knew she couldn't take care of anyone if skipping meals became a habit. The Buick started on the 2nd try. The engine warning light glowed orange on the dashboard, familiar enough that Camille barely registered it anymore. In the trunk was the blanket Isaiah used after treatment, a bag of spare clothes, and a plastic box of sugar-free hard candy. On the back seat was the notebook where Camille recorded his blood pressure in 3 different colors of ink. She was stepping away, for now, from all the small tasks that kept the 2 of them from falling apart, just to return an item to a man who likely didn't yet know he had lost it. She stopped at a self-service gas station 10 miles down the road and put in $26. The number on the pump made Camille think about how many hours behind the counter it would take to earn that back. She didn't take any money from the wallet, even though no one would have known if she'd used 1 bill and left the rest untouched. The line between returning something and keeping it doesn't always start with the whole amount. It often starts with one small reason a person allows themselves to believe. The first hotel didn't have Marcus's Mercedes. Camille drove slowly past 2 rows of cars, checked again, then turned back onto the main road. At the second hotel, she spotted the black car parked near the entrance, its body reflecting the yellow light from the overhang. She turned off the engine but sat still for a few more seconds, hands still on the wheel. That was when the exhaustion finally caught up with her, heavy, as if her body had only been waiting for her to find the right place before allowing itself to feel it. The front desk clerk couldn't give out a room number, but agreed to call up to Marcus. The phone rang several times with no answer. Marcus had put his phone on silent before going to sleep and still hadn't realized the wallet was no longer in his jacket pocket. Camille could have left it at the desk, but the cash inside made her want to hand it over to its rightful owner herself. So she sat down on the sofa by the window, placed both hands over her jacket pocket, and waited. 1 o'clock passed to the sound of the ice machine humming from the far end of the hallway. At 2, a family pulled suitcases across the lobby, a child asleep on his father's shoulder. At 3:17, Camille got a text from Isaiah. "Drive safe. I left the kitchen light on." She stared at those words for a long time, then put her phone away. At 7-Eleven, the elevator chimed. The metal doors slid open, and Marcus stepped into the lobby in a charcoal sweater, his eyes landing on the woman in a gas station uniform sitting with a wallet held on her knees. Marcus did not walk toward her right away. He looked at the wallet first, then at the dark blue uniform, the worn shoes, and the dark circles under Camille's eyes. In that brief moment, he did not see a woman who had driven nearly 40 miles in the middle of the night to return his belongings. He saw only an unmanaged situation, a stranger holding something that belonged to him, and a question that 30 years of suspicion had taught him to ask before all others. "How much do you want?" Camille thought she had misheard. She had expected Marcus to ask where the wallet was found, how long she had waited, or at the very least how she knew he was at this hotel. But the man in front of her simply stood there, his hands hanging straight at his sides, his voice as calm as if he were preparing to negotiate an unexpected expense. She stood up. Her knees had stiffened after hours on the sofa, but Camille did not let it show. She held out the wallet with both hands, not out of respect for Marcus, but because she had held onto it all night the way one holds something that matters to someone else. "You dropped it at the gas station." Marcus took it, unclasped the wallet, and checked the driver's license. He looked over the 2 bank cards, ran his finger through the compartments, then pulled out the stack of cash. The $100 bills were counted right in front of Camille, slowly, precisely, not one bill missing. She did not look away. Her exhaustion suddenly turned into something colder. Camille understood he had the right to check his own property, but she also understood that a person could reveal a great deal about how they saw the world simply by what they did first, right after getting back what they had lost. Marcus finished counting, put the money back into the wallet, then saw the photo. His finger stopped at the edge of the paper. Diane was still bent toward Julian with a smile that had outlasted her own life. In the brightly lit hotel lobby, Marcus's hand trembled so slightly that almost no one would have noticed. Camille noticed. "She looks like she loved him very much." Marcus didn't answer. He simply smoothed a curled corner of the photo flat, then tucked it back into its old slot. When he looked up, his face had returned to its familiar guarded expression. Marcus pulled out $500 bills, held them between 2 fingers, and extended them toward Camille. "For your time and gas money." Camille looked at the money. $500 would cover most of the cost of a temporary transmission repair. It was also enough to buy the books she had bookmarked on the school's website and closed the tab on, over and over. She knew exactly what she could do with each bill in his hand, but she did not reach out. "Thank you. I can't accept it." Marcus's hand stayed exactly where it was, in the empty space between them. He was not used to refusal, especially when what was being refused was money. In his world, people usually pretended to hesitate before accepting more than they had hoped for. You drove through the night, skipped your shift, and sat here for hours. No one does all that wanting nothing. Camille looked at him, not with anger, and not trying to prove she was noble. She was simply too tired to dress up the truth. "My father has kidney failure. He's lost his job, his health, and most of his ability to take care of himself. If I bring someone else's money home, he'll lose one more thing." Marcus waited for the rest, but Camille said nothing more. The hotel lobby kept running around them. The coffee machine dripped. A suitcase rolled across the tile floor. Beyond the glass doors, the sky had begun to lighten to pale blue. "What thing?" Marcus asked. "The belief that he raised me to be a decent person." The words weren't spoken loudly. They weren't delivered as a judgment. Camille simply set them down between the 2 of them, then zipped her jacket up higher, ready to return to her old car, her abandoned shift, and a father waiting under the kitchen light. Marcus lowered his hand. The 5 bills still sat between his fingers. "At least let me pay for your gas." Camille shook her head. She said that debt had already been paid, not in cash, but in the fact that she could still go home, look at her father, and not have to avoid his eyes. Then she walked out of the hotel. Marcus stood in the lobby, the wallet in one hand, the unaccepted reward in the other. Through the glass doors, he watched Camille get into the old Buick. The engine didn't start on the first try. She tried again, waited a few seconds, and then the car shuddered to life and slowly pulled out of the lot. Camille was just one of hundreds of thousands of families building their entire lives around a dialysis machine. More than 808,000 people in the United States are living with end-stage kidney failure. About 68% of them are on dialysis, and 32% are living with a transplant. Compared to white Americans, black Americans face roughly 4 times the risk of developing end-stage kidney failure. In statistical tables, that is a rate. In Camille's life, it was the dry skin on the back of her father's hand. The mornings Isaiah walked out of the treatment center as if someone had drained the weight straight out of his bones, and the money she had just handed back, even though it could have made those days easier. 2 hours later, Marcus stood before Diane's grave in St. Louis. The grass around the headstone was still wet with dew. He set down the bouquet, sat on the cold ground, and took the photo out of his wallet. 10-year-old Julian leaned against his mother's shoulder, his eyes completely without guard. Marcus remembered the last time his son had looked at him that way. He had come to this cemetery 8 times, once a year, always telling Diane about the company, the new projects, the achievements Julian had reached from a distance. This time, he told her no accomplishments. Marcus simply sat there, his finger resting on his son's face in the photo, until he realized he had spent his whole life protecting himself from being betrayed once and made an innocent person pay for it. On the way back to Chicago, Marcus drove past the exit leading to the gas station, then continued nearly half a mile further. Then he slowed down, glanced in the rearview mirror, and reached out to switch on his turn signal. Marcus continued on to the nearest turnaround, looped over the overpass, and headed back the way he had just come from. When the Mercedes pulled up at the gas station, the lot held only 2 long haul trucks and a pickup coated in road salt. The fluorescent lights were still cold and white as the night before, but the person behind the counter was not Camille. He walked in, bought a bottle of water he didn't need, then asked the woman working the morning shift about the night employee. The woman took in the expensive jacket, the car outside, and the way Marcus said Camille's full name like someone who had memorized it for a reason he wasn't ready to explain. She didn't share Camille's schedule. Marcus left a sealed envelope, inside which was only his business card and a note saying he wanted to thank her properly. Marcus nodded, set the unopened water bottle on the passenger seat, and drove back to Chicago. That afternoon, Camille called the number on the card. She would not agree to meet at Marcus's home, an office, or any workplace of his. It was Camille who set the meeting, back at the gas station on Thursday evening, while she was on shift and the store still had customers coming and going. Over the following 2 days, Marcus sat through 6 meetings, signed 3 contracts, and listened to a team of advisors present an infrastructure project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He still asked the right questions at the right moments, still caught inconsistent figures, still silenced a whole room simply by lifting his head from a document. No one knew that in his desk drawer sat an old photo he had taken out of his wallet. Diane stood beside Julian in the classroom. Marcus laid the photo flat on the wood surface, looking at it again and again between calls. He tried to remember the last time he had asked his son what he wanted without already having an answer prepared for him. The memory wouldn't come. There were only the times he'd wired money, arranged a car, called a professor, and had his assistant handle problems Julian had never asked him to solve. Thursday evening, Marcus left the office earlier than usual. He didn't notify his driver, didn't have his assistant arrange the schedule. By 10:36, the Mercedes was again parked in the cracked lot of the gas station near Bloomington. Camille was sitting behind the counter, her textbook open in front of her. She had swapped her yellow highlighter for a blue one because the old one had run dry. Beside the book sat a small cup of coffee and an open bag of unsalted crackers. When the door chimed, she looked up. Surprise showed in her eyes for only a moment before settling into calm. Lost again? That was the first time Marcus came close to smiling at a stranger without first calculating how the smile would be read. He grabbed a paper cup, poured coffee from the pot that had sat on the warmer far too long, and set it on the counter. "What are you studying?" Camille glanced at the book, as if needing to confirm the question was really meant for her and not just an opener before some other proposal. "Nursing. I'm trying to get back into the program." Marcus didn't immediately ask why she had left. He stood at the counter, took a sip of coffee bitter enough to warm his throat, then waited. Waiting did not come naturally to him. Marcus was used to filling every gap with a question, an instruction, or a decision. But Camille wasn't a report he needed to pull information out of line by line. She told him just enough. 2 years of school completed. Isaiah's dialysis sessions. The night shift that freed her days but made practicum classes almost impossible to schedule around. The old car. Tuition. Books. The days her father walked out of the center with legs so weak that Camille had to stay close but pretend not to support him, so he could still feel he was walking on his own. Marcus listened to her lay it all out without a trace of complaint in her voice. It was exactly that steadiness that made the obstacles feel heavier. Camille didn't say she was unhappy. She simply described a life with no room left for mistakes. "How much do you need to go back to school?" Camille closed the book. "That's not the only question." Marcus looked at her. She explained that tuition money didn't solve the practicum schedule, the transportation to get her father to treatment, someone to stay with him on the days his body gave out, or the hours she'd have to cut from work. Money could open a door, but if everything behind that door still fell on one person, that person would simply stand in the doorway a little longer before being forced to turn back. Marcus set his cup down. In his mind, the numbers had already begun arranging themselves: tuition, living costs, transportation, insurance, caregiving. That was how he solved everything. Break the problem into costs, then pay them. "I could write you a check." Camille didn't look offended. She just shook her head, slowly. "If I take money straight from you, every time we disagree, I'll have to ask myself whether I still owe you something." That line silenced Marcus longer than her refusal of the $500 had. He had never considered that a gift could become a leash in the eyes of the person receiving it. To Marcus, money had always been a tool of liberation. To Camille, money without clear boundaries could turn gratitude into obligation. He looked at the worn textbook, the dialysis schedule clipped to its cover, and the lunchbox half-eaten. Then Marcus took the business card from his wallet, set the blank side on the counter, and wrote another phone number on the back. "That's my personal number. I won't be giving you money." Camille looked at the card but didn't touch it yet. Marcus said he had an independent education fund with its own review board and criteria that didn't depend on his personal wishes. If Camille applied, she would be evaluated like any other candidate. He also knew of a kidney care center short on patient care assistants, one with flexible hours. No promise of being hired. No position held open for her. Just the name of the person in charge of hiring, and a door Marcus could guarantee would not be closed before her application was even read. Camille still stood still. She looked at the card, then at the man who had counted every bill in front of her 2 mornings earlier. On the counter between them, the blue highlighter rolled slightly until it touched the edge of the book. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, felt the edge of the photo of Diane and Julian that he had carried with him from the office. He didn't take it out. He just kept his fingertip resting on the thin paper while, on the other side of the counter, Camille waited for an answer that couldn't be written in money. Marcus stayed silent long enough that the sound of the cooler at the back of the store became clearer. He was used to answering hard questions with figures, terms, or a decision fast enough that no one caught the hesitation. But Camille's question wasn't asking what he could do. It was asking what he was trying to make up for. Because 30 years ago, I needed a door like that too. He didn't tell the whole Cavan story. Marcus only said he had once lost his savings, lost his first company, and lost the ability to believe that anyone would reach out a hand without wanting a stake in his life. After that, he had pulled himself back up, then used needing no one as proof that everyone else should be able to do the same. It wasn't until Camille returned the wallet that Marcus understood some people aren't short on will. They're simply spending all their strength just keeping life from sliding backward. Camille listened without interrupting. When he finished, she picked up the business card, turned it over, and read the personal number. She made no promise to call. Marcus didn't push. He paid for the coffee, left the exact amount on the counter, and walked out, carrying the unfamiliar feeling that, for the first time, he had set down an opportunity without holding on to the other end of the string. 3 days later, Camille submitted her application. She did it at 2:40 in the morning, between 2 customers buying gas. The essay asked her to explain why she wanted to return to nursing. Camille didn't write that she wanted to save lives. She wrote about an older man who once sat beside Isaiah in the waiting room, nodding along to instructions about a change in medication, then going out to the parking lot to ask her whether the white pill was for morning or evening. He had been too embarrassed to go back and ask the nurse. Camille wanted to become the kind of person who made patients feel they never had to be embarrassed for not understanding. The fund's board interviewed her 2 weeks later. Marcus was not present. Her application was assessed on her prior academic record, her caregiving experience, and her plan for completing the program. When the acceptance letter arrived, Camille read it 3 times in the small kitchen, while Isaiah sat at the table with a blanket over his knees. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, then lowered his eyes to his own hands, thinner now after months of treatment. "I'm sorry." Camille knew what he was apologizing for. Not one specific thing. Isaiah was apologizing for the mornings she'd had to stay awake, the classes she'd dropped, the relationship that had ended, and every choice she had never let him see her weighing. She knelt down to retie the laces on his right shoe. The laces were fine, but Camille needed something to do while her throat tightened. "You were never in my way." After saying that, she went on smoothing the fold of his sock that had bunched under his ankle. Others might call it filial devotion, but to Camille it was simply something that needed doing before the center's van arrived. She didn't want to turn her father into a noble reason for everything she had given up. Isaiah was a sick man, not a test placed into her life. The new opportunity didn't stretch time any wider. Camille studied in the mornings, did clinical practicum 3 days a week, and still kept 2 weekend night shifts to cover rent. At the kidney center, she started with small tasks, changing bed linens, weighing patients, logging fluid intake, wiping down handrails, and bringing blankets to those who were always cold after treatment. Some of the staff knew the wallet story. They didn't say it to her face, but Camille overheard the phrase, "the Billionaire's project," in the break room. She didn't confront it. Respect in places like that rarely comes from an explanation. It comes from knowing which patient needs an extra pillow under their arm, remembering who is prone to low blood pressure, and never pretending to understand a procedure she hasn't yet mastered. Camille was still exhausted. Some days she fell asleep in the car for 12 minutes before class. Some days her hands trembled from coffee standing in for breakfast. The scholarship had solved tuition, but it didn't do the laundry, didn't cook dinner, and didn't make Isaiah any less drained after 4 hours under the machine. One December morning, the Buick wouldn't start. Isaiah had treatment scheduled in 40 minutes. The snow from the night before had frozen into a thin layer on the windshield. Camille tried the key 3 times, heard only a dry, hollow sound from the engine, then silence. She called a tow service, but the wait was over an hour. The center had no emergency pickup available. Camille looked at the personal number Marcus had written on the back of the card. She had kept it in her wallet for months without ever using it for anything personal. This time, she called. She wasn't asking for a car for herself. She only asked if he knew of a service that could get Isaiah there on time. The black car arrived 20 minutes later, fast enough that Isaiah didn't miss his dialysis session. Camille accepted the ride that day because refusing, in that situation, would no longer have been pride. It would only have made her father the one who paid for it. But that afternoon, when Marcus called to ask if he should arrange a car for her every week, Camille said no. She told him that at the center, many patients missed treatment because of car trouble, bus routes that didn't line up, or family members who couldn't take time off work. If Marcus only sent a car for Isaiah, he would be solving one family's problem. If he truly wanted to help, he should sit down and listen to what the rest of the families needed. Marcus came to the center that Friday. No entourage, no press. He sat at the back of a small meeting room, facing a handwritten list Camille had put together. Pickup times, distances, the number of patients who missed appointments, and the neighborhoods the bus routes didn't reach. When the meeting ended, Camille hadn't gotten up yet. She turned to a new page, set her pen down on the first line, and wrote a name for a transportation program that, at that point, had no budget, no vehicles, and no one who yet knew whether it would ever be approved. She wrote, "Rides that can't be late." The name sounded more like a reminder than a project. Camille had watched too many patients sitting by the center's glass doors, still in their coats, phone in hand, checking the time again and again because whoever was supposed to pick them up hadn't shown. Some had to call a daughter working a shift at the supermarket. Some used their weekly grocery money to pay for a taxi. Some skipped treatment altogether because they didn't want to hear a manager say, one more time, that the company couldn't keep scheduling around their illness. Camille started gathering data during the hours others usually used to rest. She logged how many patients arrived late, the distance from home to the center, the bus routes that stopped running too early, and how many people depended on a relative working full-time. She didn't ask them why they hadn't planned better. She asked what had happened on the morning they couldn't make it. The answer was rarely just a broken-down car. An older woman had to care for a husband with dementia and couldn't leave him home alone. A man working at a warehouse had used up his paid leave after 2 months of treatment. A mother had to choose between her dialysis session and picking up her grandchild because her daughter wasn't allowed to leave her shift. Every story was a thread pulled taut between health and rent, between responsibility to oneself and responsibility to someone else. People like them exist in millions of kitchens, waiting rooms, and parking lots across the country. The caregiving in the U-Dache. 2025 report estimates that about 63 million Americans, nearly a quarter of all adults, provided regular care for a family member with a complex condition or disability in the previous year. That figure had grown by roughly 20 million people since 2015. More than 40% carried a high-intensity caregiving load, yet only 22% had been trained for the complex medical tasks their families were left to handle on their own. In the report, they're called unpaid caregivers. In real life, they're the people setting alarms for 4:30, learning to read a blood pressure cuff from an instruction sheet, keeping the pharmacy's number saved under favorites, and knowing exactly which sound in a loved one's breathing means it's time to call the doctor. Camille understood them because she was one of them. Her proposal wasn't simply a request for money to buy vehicles. It included off-hour treatment slots for shift workers, a benefits navigation staff member, a text message appointment reminder system, and a network of drivers paid by route. Patients who could afford it would pay a small fee. Those who couldn't would still get a ride. Camille costed out every line, not to make the plan look polished, but because she knew a program running on goodwill alone, without a clear budget, would collapse the moment its founder burned out. Marcus read the first draft of the proposal in the center's small meeting room. Old habit made him want to fix the budget section immediately, call the CAFO, and decide the funding amount himself. But Camille placed her hand on the stack of paper before he could turn to the last page. "You can fund it. You don't get to decide for the board." The short line made the two administrators in the room look down at the table. Marcus didn't react right away. 3 years earlier, no one at his company would have dared speak to him in that tone. Now, he simply withdrew his hand and asked what the criteria for evaluating the program were. Camille presented for 40 minutes. She didn't use Isaiah's story to ask for sympathy. She used missed appointment rates, readmission costs, and the number of hours patients lost waiting for transportation. When a board member asked whether she was building this program simply because her own father's car had broken down once, Camille answered that a personal problem might open someone's eyes, but it was the data that decided whether the problem belonged to the whole community. Marcus did not take part in the vote. The program was approved for a 6-month pilot with 2 vehicles, a part-time coordinator, and 3 expanded treatment slots per week. In the first month, the number of late arrivals dropped. By the 3rd month, missed sessions had fallen enough that the center began considering folding the program into its operating budget, rather than relying entirely on Marcus's fund. Camille didn't celebrate with an expensive dinner. She bought Isaiah a high-backed chair, the kind he could sit in without needing both hands to push himself back up. The chair arrived one Wednesday afternoon. Isaiah walked around it, ran his hand over the brown fabric, then asked where his daughter had bought the first thing she'd ever bought for herself. Camille was cutting the tag off the back of the chair. She bent down lower, pretending not to hear clearly. Isaiah didn't ask again. He sat down to test it, sinking slightly into the cushion, then looked at his daughter with mock seriousness. "Good chair. But it'd only be worth the money if it could cook too." Camille burst out laughing. The laugh was short, sudden enough that Isaiah smiled along with her, his hand still smoothing the new fabric, as if afraid his daughter would notice he liked the gift more than he wanted to admit. Around the same time, Marcus began driving to Julian's school without telling his assistant beforehand. He sat at the back of the hall during a planning project presentation, brought no advice with him, and called no professor afterward. Julian spotted his father as he stepped down from the podium. He didn't walk toward him right away, but he didn't turn away either. 2 weeks later, Julian came to the kidney center to see the program Camille had built. He walked in alongside Marcus but kept half a step of distance, like someone who hadn't yet decided whether he was coming home or just passing through. Julian watched Camille show an elderly patient how to book next week's ride. She spoke slowly, wrote the pickup time in large letters, and asked the man to read it back, to make sure he wasn't just nodding out of embarrassment to ask again. Afterward, Camille turned to Marcus, handed back the proposal he had just edited, and asked him to remove the clause letting the funder intervene in day-to-day operations. Julian watched his father, waiting to see how he'd react. Marcus took the papers, read the section Camille had marked, then crossed out the clause with his pen. That evening, Julian stayed in his father's car longer than necessary. He looked out through the window toward the center, where Camille was still helping Isaiah into his coat after treatment. "She's not afraid of upsetting you." Marcus rested both hands on the wheel. He looked at his son, but Julian kept his eyes turned outward. "No," he said. And I'm learning not to make that something she has to pay for. 3 months later, Camille sat in front of her computer in the small kitchen at 9:42 in the morning. Isaiah was asleep in his room after dialysis. The cup of coffee beside her had gone cold, and her inbox still didn't hold the subject line she'd been waiting weeks for. She hit refresh for the 7th time. The screen flickered, then a new email appeared from the nursing licensure board. Camille opened the email with a finger stiff from gripping the mouse too long. The first line held only a few words, but she read them 3 times before understanding there was no comma, no condition trailing after them. She had passed the exam. In the small kitchen, the fridge kept humming. The microwave clock still ran 4 minutes slow, and Isaiah's new chair still carried the faint smell of unfaded fabric. There was no music, no one standing by ready to applaud. Just Camille sitting motionless in front of the screen, both hands over her mouth so the sound of her crying wouldn't wake her father. Isaiah was already awake. He appeared in the bedroom doorway in his old robe, one hand braced on the frame. Camille turned her chair around but couldn't speak right away. She just pointed at the screen. Isaiah walked over slowly, bent down to read, then rested a cold hand on top of his daughter's head, the same way he had when she was small, and brought home a test with a high score. "You did it." Those words made Camille bury her face against her father's chest. Isaiah no longer had the strength to hold her tightly, so he kept one hand at the back of her neck and the other on her shoulder. The two of them stood like that in the middle of the kitchen, beside the still unpaid bills and the pillbox sorted by day. Isaiah cried without making a sound. His tears fell into his daughter's hair, and Camille realized this was the first time in years that her father was crying over something life had given back, rather than something it had taken away. The second person Camille called was Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. In his office on the 42nd floor, Marcus was sitting alone in front of the glass wall overlooking Chicago. He had known the results might come that week, but he hadn't asked anyone to check, hadn't called the board, and hadn't tried to find out before Camille did. Some of the changes in Marcus were small enough that outsiders would never have noticed. Leaving a door open without standing behind it to control what came through was one of them. "I passed." Marcus closed his eyes. He wanted to say he'd known she would, but the words sounded too much like someone claiming a share of the achievement. So he simply congratulated her, then let the rest of the silence belong to Camille. Inside that silence were the nights at the gas station, the mornings spent sleeping in the car, and the shoes Isaiah used to hide under the bed. Neither of them needed to say it out loud. Both understood the cost behind the short sentence just spoken. 2 months later, Camille signed a formal contract with the kidney center. The salary was enough for her to stop working night shifts and move to an apartment in the same neighborhood that had an elevator, so Isaiah wouldn't have to stop twice climbing the stairs. She bought a reliable used car on a loan in her own name. The scholarship had ended. The practicum had ended. Marcus no longer had anything to do with her salary, her title, or her career going forward. He waited 6 more months before asking Camille to dinner. The invitation came in the center's hallway, right after they'd finished reviewing a report on the transportation program. Marcus made clear this wasn't a meeting and had nothing to do with work. Camille looked at him longer than usual. She didn't say yes right away, but she didn't say no either. That evening, when she told Isaiah, her father didn't ask how wealthy Marcus was. He only asked how she felt being around that man with no file or project standing between them. Camille said she didn't know yet. She agreed to dinner a week later, but chose a small place near her apartment instead of the restaurant Marcus suggested. He arrived on time, brought no flowers, and booked no private room. Their first dinner held no declarations. Camille talked about a patient who had called the wrong pickup number. Marcus talked about how Julian had just turned down a job he'd arranged and found another position on his own. He told the story without hiding his pride and without turning his son's refusal into disrespect. The months that followed didn't change Camille's life through grand gestures. Marcus learned to sit in Isaiah's living room without checking his phone every 5 minutes. After a few visits, Camille noticed he always set his phone face down on the table before a meal began. Even on evenings, no one mentioned it. A bag of unsalted crackers, the kind Isaiah used after treatment, started appearing in Marcus's car. He never said who he'd bought them for. Marcus ate a slightly bland bean stew and never once offered to hire a chef. When Isaiah's old radio lost sound on one side, Marcus sat on the floor with him for nearly an hour, unscrewing each piece, listening more than talking. The radio never got fixed in the end. Isaiah set it back on the shelf anyway, because what he'd needed that evening had never really been the sound. Julian began showing up at those dinners. Camille never asked him about his childhood and never tried to explain Marcus in his place. She kept a chair for Julian, remembered he didn't eat raw onions, and let father and son sit through their own silences without rescuing them from the discomfort. Little by little, Marcus learned that staying in a room after being turned away sometimes mattered more than any explanation. One spring evening, Isaiah called Marcus out onto the balcony while Camille washed dishes. He spoke slowly, his breath shorter than it used to be. He didn't need a man to save his daughter, and he didn't want Camille turned into proof of anyone's transformation. What he needed to know was whether Marcus would let her go on being the woman who had lived 32 years before ever meeting him. Marcus looked through the glass. Camille was drying a plate, Julian standing beside her packing leftovers into a container. The small kitchen looked nothing like his penthouse, but it held something that vast home had never managed to hold. "I don't want her shrinking her life to fit mine," Isaiah nodded, offering no blessing and no further warning. He simply patted Marcus's arm and went back inside. 3 years after the night the wallet was found, a new patient support center opened in Bloomington. After the last guest left the ceremony, Marcus stood beside the Mercedes in the parking lot and asked Camille if she'd like to drive south with him for a while. He didn't say where they were headed. Camille looked at the black leather wallet showing in his jacket pocket, then opened the passenger door. Camille sat down in the passenger seat, set her bag under her feet, then pulled the seatbelt across her shoulder. Marcus didn't turn on the radio. He drove south along the same stretch of road he had driven 3 years before, when the person beside him hadn't yet known his name, and the black leather wallet was still lying on the gas station floor, wedged between a box of crackers and a metal shelf leg. The late spring afternoon still held plenty of light. On both sides of the highway, young fields stretched to the horizon. Marcus drove slower than usual. He didn't check the clock, didn't take any calls, and didn't try to fill the silence with some story prepared in advance. Camille noticed his left hand gripping the wheel tighter than usual, but she didn't ask. When the gas station sign came into view ahead, she turned to look at him. Half the sign had been fitted with new bulbs. The lot still had its old cracks, but the trash bin that used to lean against the fence was gone. Marcus parked near the door, in the very spot where Camille's Buick used to sit waiting for the engine to catch on the morning she came to return the wallet. Inside, the fluorescent lights still washed everything the same faint pale color. The coffee machine had been replaced, but its smell was still bitter and familiar. A young woman stood behind the counter, reading a book while the store sat empty of customers. Camille looked at the book, at the highlighter resting on the page, and thought of the night shifts when her whole life had been only a few lines away from a future she could read between customers buying gas. Marcus bought 2 cups of coffee. He didn't lead Camille straight to the exact spot where the wallet had once lain. The two of them sat at the small table by the window, where the plastic laminate had peeled up at one corner. Marcus took the wallet out and set it down in front of him. The leather had softened, the stitching along the edges darkened from years of being carried. He opened it and set the photo of Diane and Julian down on the table. Diane was still bent over her son in the classroom, her smile held in place from an afternoon now more than 10 years gone. Marcus took out another photo. The new one had been taken in Isaiah's kitchen the previous Thanksgiving. Julian stood by the stove, holding a ladle with an uncertain look. Isaiah sat in his brown recliner, pointing at the pot as if giving orders. Camille was turned sideways, her hair hastily pinned up, and Marcus stood behind her, one hand holding a plate, the other resting lightly on the back of her chair. No one in the photo was looking at the camera. They were looking at each other. Marcus set the 2 photos side by side, smoothing the edge of the older one flat. He said that for his whole life, every offer he made had come with a condition. Contracts had exit clauses, investments had collateral, trust always carried a way out in case someone let him down. Camille didn't interrupt. She looked at his hands. The same hands that had once counted every bill in front of her now rested quietly beside the 2 family photos. Marcus took a small box from his jacket pocket. He didn't open it right away, didn't stand up to call for anyone's attention. The young woman behind the counter kept reading. A man at pump 4 was wiping his windshield. Outside, trucks kept passing along the highway, just like any ordinary afternoon. This time, there are no conditions. Marcus's voice was lower than usual. He said Camille owed him nothing, not for the wallet, not for the scholarship, not for any door that had ever been opened. She could walk out of that gas station and keep her job, her apartment, her patient care program, and her own life exactly as it was. Nothing would be taken back. No one would be punished. And he didn't need her to say yes out of gratitude. Then Marcus opened the box. The ring inside was simpler than Camille expected. No oversized stone, nothing showy about it, nothing chosen to prove what he could afford. Marcus had asked Julian to come along when he picked it out. Isaiah hadn't come, but had sent word that his daughter worked with her hands every day, so the ring needed to be something she could wear without taking it off before caring for a patient. Marcus stood, then knelt near the edge of the table, not exactly where the wallet had once fallen, but close enough that they would both remember. "Will you build a family with me?" Camille looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't thinking about the penthouse, the money, or anything a marriage like that could bring. She was thinking of Marcus, sitting on the floor fixing a broken radio with her father, even though he'd known from the start that buying a new one would have been easier. She was thinking of the time he sat at the back of Julian's hall and made no call to any professor afterward. She was thinking of the evenings Marcus washed dishes in that small kitchen, always putting the spoons in the wrong drawer, never once asking someone else to do it for him. She looked through the glass door, where the late afternoon light was settling over the Mercedes, then looked at the man who had once believed no one could do something kind without expecting to be paid for it. Yes, Marcus bowed his head for a brief moment, as if his body needed time to understand that some things are given, not won. When he stood, Camille held out her hand on her own. Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, his fingers trembling more visibly than they had the night he touched Diane's photo in the hotel lobby. They married 6 months later in a small church in Bloomington. Julian stood beside his father. Isaiah walked Camille to the front pew, but when the pastor asked who was giving the bride away, he didn't use that word. He said he was simply walking alongside his daughter to a place she had chosen for herself. 2 years later, the 12-seat table in the penthouse was no longer pushed against the window like a decorative piece. A child's booster seat now sat between Camille and Marcus. Julian often arrived late because of work. Isaiah always complained that the food in expensive kitchens still needed more pepper, and Marcus and Camille's little daughter had a habit of hiding spoons under napkins and watching everyone search for them. That evening, Marcus was holding her on one arm, trying to spoon soup with the other. Camille stood by the kitchen counter, still in her clothes from the kidney center, her hair not yet out of its bun. Julian walked in carrying bread. Isaiah called from the living room that they were already 10 minutes late starting. While the child in Marcus's arms reached for the black leather wallet he had just set down beside his bowl, pulled it toward herself, and began using her 2 small hands to try to work open the clasp that had held the family's photographs year after year. The clasp popped open, and the 2 photos slid out onto the table. One held the family Marcus had once lost. The other held the family he had learned to build from the ground up. The little girl pointed at each face, not yet understanding that her parents' lives had changed course because of one distant night, when an exhausted woman stood before $4,100 and chose to go home with empty hands but an intact conscience. Perhaps kindness isn't always repaid right away. Some right things bring no reward, are witnessed by no one, and don't make life any easier the next morning. But every choice quietly builds the person we're becoming. Camille returned a wallet. Marcus got back his trust. Julian found his father again. Isaiah got to see his daughter live a life of her own without having to give up her love for him. Sometimes, what we give away in kindness doesn't come back in the same shape. It might return as a door, a seat at the table, someone who stays when life gets hard, or a home filled with the sound of children laughing where there was once only silence. How do you feel about Camille's choice and Marcus's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you've met someone who did something kind when no one was watching, or maybe you've stood before a choice just like Camille's yourself. Your story could be exactly what someone out there needs to hear today. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. See you in the next journey, where ordinary people can still change each other's lives through choices that seem so small.